Hello, everyone, and welcome to our module, which will talk about Chapter 11, Part 1, which focuses on the news interview. The news interview is used in the industry to refer to two different things. It can either refer to the social interaction between a person of public interest and the professional writer, which is the act of interviewing, or it can refer to the product of that interaction, which is the actual interview that you then publish. So know that it can be used both as a verb and a noun, which technically mean two different things, but I just wanted to make that distinction in your mind. Now, the news interview has a very rich history in journalism. In the 1700s, we had an overtly partisan press, which mainly used essays that were very much biased and politically combative. And so as the penny papers rose in the 1830s, the reporting aspect, the news gathering aspect, became much more important. However, we really didn't talk to officials a whole lot, and we didn't use quotes in the 1800s. For example, President Lincoln remains one of the American presidents who was never quoted by the press. You can see that we have not always had a rich history of a news interview, and it can be done another way. But in modern journalism history, post-Civil War, interviews became very important. One of the first news coverage to use interviews, especially of officials, was during the Helen Jewett murder, which was a very famous murder in the 1800s. It's actually a fascinating case. But James Gordon Bennett worked hand in hand with law enforcement and politicians in the coverage of that murder. And it really was one of the first times that interviews were used as a news gathering practice in America. In the mid 1800s, Horace Greeley actually interviewed and then published a conversation with Brigham Young, who is a well-known religious figure. And that really became one of the first feature interviews. Joseph McCullough was the first to interview and cite a president within a news piece, interviewing President Johnson. And so you can see the history of the news interview starting to develop here. However, it really wasn't until the 1900s when the news interview became a solid part of news gathering practice. But by 1905, practically the whole of the newspaper is based on the interview because journalists were recognizing the importance of going out and seeking information from the community and from its officials. And in fact, by the 1980s, 3/4 of all journalism stories relied so heavily on interviews that they never even cited an official document. So you can see that news interviews are a critical aspect of reporting and something that you as a media writer really need to practice and develop as a key skill. So why would you use interviews? Well, the most basic reason is to gather information. Even if you're only using interviews to check facts that you're given from a document or from something you hear from another source, that's okay. You don't actually have to publish an actual interview in order to complete the verb of interviewing. So fact checks and gathering of information are important. We also need to have voices of experts to provide credibility for information and facts that are shared. For instance, using Dr. Fauci within the COVID-19 reporting allows us to have a voice of an expert in the field giving us information that the public can trust more than if just a general reporter said it. We also want to hear the voices of those affected because it allows us to relate more personally to stories. A lot of this is done through narrative, and it allows us to inject emotions into our piece so they don't become just very basic fact sharing. Instead, having sources and interviews allows us to provide color and points of view. Because remember, we as journalists cannot share our own emotions about something. We can't provide our own opinions. So instead, we must rely on the news interview to provide those elements to our story. So interviews are one of the prime ways that we as journalists remain impartial and prevent bias in our writing. And sometimes they can be really funny too. Now, conducting an interview takes place in multiple steps. The first step is to really find the topic or angle of the story that you're going to be telling. Based on that, you're going to need to find sources that will help you with that angle and then determine how many sources are needed, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. Then you'll actually need to set up the interviews in proper locations. You'll need to research your sources. You'll need to brainstorm and write out questions. You'll need to actively listen during the interview. You need to come prepared and on time, be professional, and review your research and your interview notes in order to write up the story. So that's the basics of how to conduct an interview. We'll be talking about most of these points in greater detail in this video and later videos. Now, finding an interview or a source is an important task for a journalist because you're going to need to consider what story you're writing and who would provide the best and most important interview for that angle or topic. For instance, if I'm writing about how the disease spreads for COVID-19, would I prefer to speak with a doctor who specializes in infectious disease, or would I prefer to speak to a student? I'd probably prefer to speak to a doctor in that case, right? But if the angle of my COVID-19 story is how students have been affected by remote or staggered learning schedules, then I'm probably going to want to talk to a student more than I'm going to want to talk to a doctor. Now, I can use both of those interviews together to support the information, but you need to realize which is more important based on the topic that you're writing about. You also need to ask what information you need and who would be the best to provide that. Again, if I'm writing a feature story about how students are affected, then I'm going to need a more personal angle rather than having kind of that official expert soundbite. Instead, I'm going to want to have an emotional piece, someone who's been highly affected. So even within the wide array of students, who would be the best student to provide me an emotional story about how their lives have been affected by COVID-19? So usually brief and interviews are usually brief, and they tend to be focused on getting a certain type of information. So you're really not going to an expert or a doctor to get the emotional aspect most of the time. You're really there to get the facts, and then you'll use a different type of source to inject emotion. So keep your interviews brief, keep them focused, and know what type of information you're hoping to receive from each source. Now, another important thing to remember with media sourcing is the fact that when we rely too heavily on experts, we can bias our information and really present a worldview that is unfair to certain populations. So when you look at the Entman and Rejecki Index of Race and Media, it shows that networks tend to go to white sources far more often than Blacks. The only time when we use African Americans more often than whites in news stories as sources is when we're talking about them as criminals within sports and within entertainment. And those are only feeding into stereotypes about members of the Black population. Now, rarely are African Americans or Black people shown making important contributions to serious business of the nation. For instance, when we use interviews about foreign affairs, we use white sources 99 times and a Black source 1 time. That's really sad. The number of sound bites on economics is very similar. on electoral politics, but you can see that the gap closes a little bit when we're talking about sports and entertainment. There we have 35 by whites, blacks 11. And then sound bites on crime tend to be uttered by whites 149% of the time, but by blacks 24. But add that statistic to the finding below, where Black defendants are treated differently on local TV. When we see African Americans or Blacks depicted most, it's through a mugshot, because Black people are 4 times more likely to be shown in a mugshot on local TV than a white criminal. And then we also show people handcuffed or physically restrained by officers twice more often for Blacks than whites. And then the name of the accused is less likely to be shown with Black defendants than whites, meaning that they are nameless people in terms of the visual elements. So think about the implications that this repetitive nature of sourcing has on our community and society at large. So experts are not always the best source, and certainly not the only source. Our sources need to reflect our communities, which means if you are a member of the white community, you need to step outside your comfort zone and interview people of all races, of all backgrounds, of all demographics. Same for people who are Black. You cannot only speak to Black sources, you need to step outside your comfort zone as well and speak to people who are different than you. That's really when some of the most beautiful stories come about. And if you'll remember our interview with Dr. George Daniels, this is something he really encourages for young writers, because the more easily you can step outside your comfort zone and break your habits of going to people you know as sources, the better your writing will be. You'll get a better range of opinions, emotions, and you'll just have a better story overall. 2 other things you need to consider in terms of sourcing is finding speakers who can deliver information in a short, concise way. So if you have someone that speaks very long sentences or kind of rabbit trails, they don't really make for a great source because you have to clip their information. This is especially true in broadcast, where the timing of the quote matters. But also length matters in terms of print or digital journalism. So find people and encourage your sources to speak in short sound bites. And they also need to be able to translate complicated information back down to that 3rd to 8th grade level, so that your sources aren't using jargon and things that don't really help the general public understand what they're talking about. So there's no real needed number of sources per story. There's no magic number that says, hey, you did the right number of sources. It really varies depending upon various aspects of your story, such as your deadlines, the expertise that is needed, the amount of controversy that's needed, because the more controversial something is, the more sources you're going to need to support the various sides of that controversy, and how complex an issue is. So you really can't do an entire story on immigration just using one source, right? Because it's such a complex issue that it really needs to be examined a little bit more in depth. Now, when you're setting up your interview, you need to consider your deadlines. So a lot of times people will say, can I have 2 or 3 days? And you're like, no, I have literally 3 hours to write this story. So make sure that you're using sources who will get back to you quickly, but be respectful of their time as well. If you set up an interview, don't be late. Come on time, be professional, and don't take forever because you didn't come prepared. Also, you want to think about the location that you do your interview. This is especially true for broadcasting, but it's really true of all interviews, that you don't want to go to a really crowded, loud place where you can't hear the interview very well. You don't want to go to a place that has a super boring background where you can't get any supporting images, especially if you're doing a video interview. So you're really wanting to find that nice blend of having something interesting going on, but still being quiet enough where that person can be heard and easily understood within conversation. So another important thing to remember, and something that often does not happen in journalism but needs to, is you need to research your source. The quality of the information you get from an interview depends upon the amount of preparation you do. You need to know the background of your source. Where did they go to school? What are their current beliefs? How do they vote? You need to know your interviewee. And if you are the source yourself, let's say you're in PR, for instance, and someone calls you and asks you to do an interview, you need to do research on your reporter. And so this really should work as a symbiotic research relationship. You need to know your interview goals, and you need to find balance between reaching your goals as a reporter or PR professional and giving the reporter or organization what they want to. So balance those out. So you're going to want to use previous files or clips from your station or newspaper to see whether that source has been used before, and if so, how they acted as a source. You're going to use things like their press release or their media kit, but make sure you fact check them because those aren't always accurate. And a lot of times they skew information to bias in favor of the organization. You can always use the internet, and heaven forbid you step into a library in order to do some research. The next thing you need to do is create interview questions. This isn't just a random off the top of your head list. You really should be writing down your interview questions. So you need to review your research, align it with your interview goals, find the main topics. And as you're writing questions, make sure you use open-ended questions. Don't use questions that the source could answer yes or no, because they will. And that's not a good interview clip, right? You can't use that. So the more specific your questions, the better. You want to mix soft and hard questions. So you don't want to just be on the attack all the time. Even if you're in an investigative interview, you want to try to balance back and forth. You want to be aware of bias, cultural, or discriminatory language. Ask questions, but don't give commentary. Remember, you don't have an opinion. You don't have an emotional tie to this. Even if you are interviewing a dictator, you're going to treat them as a person, regardless of what your personal belief about their politics is. So you want to use questions that use very general, basic terms. What, how, why, and sometimes who. So you'll create a list of questions, actually writing them down. At the very, very minimum, if you're very rushed, you can write a list of bullet points, but you really want to create that list of questions so you can refer to them throughout your interview. You're going to always want to ask the source at the beginning of the interview to say and spell their name and provide their title. This ensures that you're going to cite them accurately. Consider using softball questions first to warm them up, to get them to trust you, to create a rapport with your interviewee. You're going to want to ask harder questions in the middle, somewhat to catch them unaware of the difficult question you may be asking them, but also because you've established that trust by then. Your closing questions need to repair any damage you've done, especially in investigative interviews. So you never want to end with a really hard or digging question. So kind of return back to those softballs at the end. You always want to ask as your last question, do you have anything else to add that we haven't talked about? And a lot of times people will answer this in very unique ways. It kind of catches them off guard sometimes. So you might even get your best sound bites off these questions. I know that was my experience as a reporter. This was always the number one question that I would get some like really wacky, non-rehearsed answers that actually ended up being the best sound that I would get in the interview. So think of the anticipated answers as well when you're writing your questions, so that when you don't get a proper answer because they're being vague or trying to bridge back to their talking points, you as the reporter can tell more easily that they're doing that and kind of call them on it and ask them to be more direct or specific in their answer. So is this a good interview question? Say and spell your name. Yeah, it actually is, because you want to make sure you get their name and title. What about, would you like it if this measure passed? Probably not. We're not being very specific with this measure. And oh, by the way, I can just say yes or no and not have to elaborate. So that's not a good interview question. Tell me about your feelings on the current legislation. Technically, this is a statement, but it could get you the desired answer if what you're looking for is opinions on the current legislation. Now, you probably should be a little more specific about what that legislation is, but if you've already covered it in the introduction, then perhaps this is okay. So it's not a great question, but it's not a bad one either. Why do you feel that the proposed amendment endangers the rights of women? This is a much better question than the previous one because it is more specific. It's guiding them towards a more detailed answer, and it makes them focus on the aspect that you're wanting them to answer. As a Black person, do you think police brutality is an issue in the community? Is this a good interview question? No, absolutely not. We never want to make a member of a specific identity or a social community to have to answer for the entire population. That is stereotypical and not appropriate. Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you would like to address in the interview? Like I said, this is a great wrap-up interview question, so you can certainly use this as your last question. So now that we've gone over how to draft interview questions, now it's your turn. Create a list of 15 to 20 questions for your peer interview. That interview should last between 15 to 45 minutes. So make sure you have enough questions to get the information you need, and make sure they follow these rules of how to draft questions. It'll be due Monday, September 28th at midnight. And remember, if you don't get approval on your questions from me, you can't proceed with the assignment. So make sure you do it. In fact, try to work ahead, because the earlier that I approve your questions, the more time you'll have to interview and to get more writing time.